1856. Winter punished the Ohio River Valley. Enslaved families dreamed of the crossing for freedom, but each step was risky. Among them was Margaret Garner, a young mother who had fled with her husband and children, leaving behind the farm in the Kentucky where they lived chained. In the cold crossing, every breath was a challenge, but the hope of freedom fed on its steps. Until, at dawn, slave hunters and law officers surrounded the house where they hid. It was at this moment that Margaret made the most extreme and tragic decision of her life. Instead of allowing her daughter to be dragged back to slavery, she preferred to take her life. The scene shocked America. For some, it was proof of the barbarism of slavery. For others, the most brutal image of a mother's despair who knew what she meant living in chains. Margaret Garner's name would echo for centuries as a symbol of pain, resistance, and the cruelty of a system that transformed even maternal love into tragedy. Stories like this reveal the dimension of the despair of enslaved mothers and the violence surrounding them. If you believe Margaret's memory should be remembered, subscribe to the channel and answer in the comments. Do you think Margaret's decision was crazy, or the most extreme act of love and resistance? Margaret's heavy breath mingled with the deaf sound of the currents that held her, echoing subtly in the damp morning air on Kentucky. The dense smell of blood and sweat was constant, a relentless memory of oppression that choked any hope of freedom. The rising sun was barely illuminated the worn wood huts, where the life of the slaves began even before the first rays of light played the horizon. Margaret Garner was born in one of these cabins, amid a stormy night that seemed to witness the hardness of his future life. It was 1856, a year when slavery still dictated the fate of thousands in the South of the United States, where the value of a human being was measured by his weight in a harvested cotton. From an early age, Margaret has learned the meaning of the word possession, not just as a concept, but as a brutal and inescapable reality. The farm where she lived was vast, a sea of green interrupted only by the methodical rows of plantations that needed incessant care. The earthy smell of the vegetation mingled with the poignant aroma of the leather of the whips, always ready to punish any slip, real or imagined. The shouts of the whipped were a macabre symphony that punctuated the hours of the day, a constant memory that any resistance would be crushed with relentless violence. The owners of the farm, the McGregor, were known for their cruelty. James McGregor, the patriarch, had large and heavy hands, always ready to surround anyone who dared to disobey. His eyes, cold as steel, showed no compassion or mercy. Mary McGregor, his wife, was a mirror of his brutality, hiding behind a forced smile, a wicked soul that delighted to see others suffer. Margaret, from a young age, has known the weight of hard work. His hands, small, shaky, learned the cotton spoon under the sun, while his shoulders hurt under the burden of heavy bales. Even so, she kept a firm look, a spark of determination that refused to erase. Her hair, soaked with sweat, stuck to his forehead as she worked, but with every fiber she pulled out of the ground, she clung to a silent hope that one day could be free. Life at Kentucky was a visible prison without visible grids, where freedom was a distant, almost unreachable dream. Margaret grew up listening to the whispered stories of land where men were free, where the chains were not made of iron, but from choices. The other slaves shared such stories on silent nights when the stars were the only witnesses of their hopes and fears. Over the years, Margaret became a strong woman, with scars that told stories of resistance and pain. Her skin carried marks of whip and violent hands, but also of love and care. For even in slavery, she found ways to be kind to others, to offer a smile or a gesture of kindness. His mother, a figure of strength and resilience, taught him the importance of maintaining dignity, even when everything seemed lost. With each dawn, Margaret rose with the determination of those who did not accept resigning to the fate. The cold winter wind cut like blades but was unable to erase the flame that burned in his chest. In moments of loneliness, she dreamed of a world where she could walk freely, where her children would not know the weight of the chains. It was a vision that kept her firm, an anchor that prevented the desperation from consuming her. In that microcosm of suffering and resistance, Margaret Garner was forged as a woman who would not allow oppression to define her existence. And while life at Kentucky continued her relentless cycle, she secretly nourished the hope that one day she could break the currents that held her, not just her, but to all she loved. The sharp wind of the winter night, he was among the trees, carrying the smell of snow and hope. Margaret Garner, with his heart throbbing like a drum, firmly held the hand of Robert, her husband, while the young children nestled shivering between them. Darkness was a silent ally, covering his cautious steps toward the Ohio River, which served as a liquid promise of freedom. The sound of the chains that had been his arrest for so long echoed in his ears, but now it was the sound of the river that dominated, a constant whisper that invited her to cross to a world where the chains had no place. Margaret felt the overwhelming weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the certainty that a single step in false step could seal the fate of all of them. Robert, with his view, confirmed the way ahead, guiding them through the dense forest that bordered the McGregor farm. Each crack of branch under his feet seemed a thunder in the silence of the night, but fear was not enough to stop them. Margaret kept his children, small shadows, close to his body, covering them with the warmth of his own body and the promise of a better future. Crossing was dangerous, they knew, but the cruel reality of staying in the clutches of McGregor was an even more feared sentence. The stories of slaves who had tried to flee and were recaptured, punished with unimaginable brutality, were not rare. Margaret, however, had made his decision. He would rather face death to allow his children to grow under the yoke of slavery. The Ohio River, with its dark, gelid waters, emerged before them as a sleeping giant. Margaret's pulsations accelerated even more, but she didn't hesitate. With Robert leading, they entered the water, which stole their breath with their sharp cold. The frightened children clung to them, and Margaret whispered words of encouragement, promises that they would soon be free. As they advanced, the current seemed to want to drag them back, but Margaret's willpower was greater. Each stroke was a battle against fear and despair, but also a statement of resistance. The sound of the river swallowed their whispers of fear, turning them into shouts of challenge. Margaret felt his children's hands by squeezing his own, and it gave him courage. Finally, after which it seemed eternity, they reached the opposite margin. Panting and exhausted, they fell into the safety of land, their heavy water and sweat clothes. The children looked around, confused, but in Margaret's eyes, there was a new determination. The north side of the Ohio River promised something they had never known: freedom. Margaret knew the journey was far from over, but this was the first step of many. They needed to move fast, find allies, and, above all, stay out of the reach of slave hunters. Robert, always attentive, helped her get up, and together with her children in her arms began the walk towards the unknown. The forest around him seemed to breathe along with them, a silent accomplice of his escape. The stars, silent witnesses, blinked in the sky, and Margaret felt a renewed strength, as if the universe conspired in his favor. The cold was still sharp, but the warmth of hope warmed them from the inside out. This was the first night of many, but each step led them further from a life of oppression and closer to a dream that Margaret refused to let him die. And so, with the Ohio River behind him and the promise of freedom ahead, Margaret Garner and his family went ahead, determined to make his escape not only an act of despair, but a cry of resistance that would echo over the ages. The snow was beginning to fall gently on the ground hardened by winter, covering the earth with a white cloak that seemed to promise peace and tranquility. But for Margaret Garner, every flake that touched her skin was a cold reminder of the urgency that hung over her and her family. They had managed to cross the Ohio River, a feat that many dare not even dream. But now, in a territory where freedom was a closer concept, reality was as relentless as the currents they left behind. The house that served as a refuge for fugitive slaves was a simple construction, but emanated an aura of hope and resistance. The wooden walls, although worn out of time, offered a comfort that Margaret had never experienced. However, the air inside the house was impregnated with a palpable nervousness as the sounds from abroad, the rustle from the wind between the trees and the distant wolf howl, they mingled with the anxious whispers from those who hid there. Margaret and Robert were welcomed by a community of abolitionists who operated in secret, risking their lives and freedoms to offer shelter to those who fled the relentless claws of slavery. It was a fragile system, supported by the courage and solidarity of men and women who believed in a world without chains. But, like any clandestine net, it was always on the brink of collapse, threatened by betrayal and constant surveillance of slave hunters. Inside the house, Margaret was busy taking care of her children, trying to convey a sense of normality amid the chaos around them. Her innocent look sought answers that she did not yet have, but her hands, small and hot, squeezed hers, conveying a silent confidence that strengthened her. Robert, always attentive, helped in the chores of refuge, as his eyes constantly swept the horizon in search of any sign of danger. The nights were the hardest. The silence, broken only by the occasional stalids of wood in the fireplace, brought with it memories of a life of suffering and fear. Margaret was lying down with her children, her little bodies nestled to hers, and tried to sleep. But sleep was a rare visitor. Instead, she kept a warning, the senses sharp for any sound that indicated that they had been discovered. And then it happened. The The sound of horse hooves echoing along the snow-covered road was approaching, a foreshadowing of terror that froze Margaret's blood. The slave hunters had found their refuge. Margaret's heart accelerated, her breathing became superficial and quick, and she felt the panic start to take care. But the determination of protecting your family spoke louder. With quick and accurate movements, Margaret and Robert agreed their children and other refugees. The house, which was once a safe haven, became a whirlwind of frantic activity. The children were instructed to remain silent, and Margaret hid them in a trapdoor under the floor, along with other mothers and their little ones. Robert, along with the other men, armed herself with what she could find, cooking knives and farm tools, preparing for the imminent confrontation. Slave hunters, led by a man with cold, cruel eyes named Caleb Turner, descended from the mounts with the confidence of predators who had trapped their prey. Turner, known for his brutality, had a wicked smile on his face as he ordered his men to surround the house. Fear permeated the air, but Margaret refused to give in. Inside the trapdoor, the silence was oppressive. Margaret held her children firmly, feeling her quick and interspersed breaths. She whispered words of encouragement, promises that everything would look good, although her heart was heavy with uncertainties. The sound of heavy steps above his head was a constant reminder of the danger he stared at so close. Suddenly, the sound of wood was echoed around the house. The hunters had forced the entrance, and now they searched each corner, their rough voices filling the air with threats and insults. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, seeking strength within her. She knew that if they were found, mercy would not be an option. But at that moment of despair, a decision made shape in his mind. It was a terrible choice, but one she was prepared to do. Death, Margaret thought, was preferable to slavery. And if she came to that, she would do whatever she was needed to make sure her children never tried the currents that had tortured her for so long. The tension in the house was almost tangible, and the sounds of struggle and resistance above resonated as a macabre symphony. Margaret, however, remained firm, a lioness protecting her puppies with courage that challenged despair. As the slave hunters approached, she prayed silently, not for salvation, but by virtue to face what was to come. And while the winter cold involved the refuge house, Margaret Garner was preparing to fight until his last sigh, determined to protect his family at any cost. The flame of resistance burned intensely within it, an indomitable force that no slave hunter could extinguish. And so, in the midst of terror and uncertainty, his story of courage and sacrifice continued to unfold, a powerful testimony of the human spirit in his purest state. The siege closed over the house with relentless ferocity, like a predator who finally found his prey. The officers, led by Caleb Turner, a man whose heart was as cold as the steel of his weapons, invaded refuge with brutality. The old wood of the main door shattered in a thick door, a sound that resonated like a scream of despair in the silence of the night. The smell of gunpowder mixed the cold air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of fear and oppression. Downstairs, in the trapdoor, Margaret Garner could hear the heavy steps of the officers echoing through the floor above his head. The sound of the leather of the boots against the wood was a relentless reminder that the freedom that had proved briefly was about to be torn from them. She held her children, her small, shaky hands clinging to her skirt as her hearts beat unison with hers, a symphony of despair and determination. Margaret knew what her children expected if they were taken back. She had seen with her own eyes the horror that was slaughtered over those who were captured after failed escapes. The whipping did not forgive, and the marks it left on the skin were just part of the price they paid. But the worst was the death of the spirit, the destruction of hope, something Margaret refused to allow her children to experience. Above, the house was immersed in chaos. Robert and the other men fought bravely, transforming household items into makeshift weapons. The fight was unequal, but they refused to surrender. The sound of furniture being knocked down and glass breaking the air, along with the screams of anger and pain. Each blow to the officers was answered with a fierce resistance, a determination fueled by the despair of those who have nothing more to lose. Caleb Turner, with his cruel smile, commanded his men efficiently. He was known for his ability to hunt and capture fugitive slaves, and the prospect of another victory only fed his thirst for violence. He moved around the house with the confidence of who knows that the result was already decided. His cold eyes passed through the shadows, seeking any sign of the fugitives who knew how to be hidden there. Within the trapdoor, time seemed to drag itself. Margaret squeezed her children against her chest, her small, hot bodies an anchor for her sanity amid the panic that threatened her mastering her. His eyes were closed, but every fiber of his being was alert, ready to act. She whispered words of love and courage to her children, promises that they would always be together, no matter what happened. And then, as if the destination had finally decided to reveal his hand, one of the officers found the trapdoor. Margaret heard the sound of the wood being scratched and then torn off, and knew the moment had arrived. The trapdoor was opened with a crash, and the cruel light of a flashlight flooded the small space, exposing them to the merciless eyes of Turner and his men. Margaret looked up, finding the eyes of Caleb Turner. There was a glow of triumph on his face, a certainty that the victory was yours. But Margaret was not a woman who was easily intimidated. She looked at him with a determination that no chain could break, a silent fury that burned in her eyes. The officer began to go down, but was interrupted by a vision that he did not expect. Margaret, with a kitchen knife in his hands, a simple object, but in the hands of a desperate mother turned into a protective weapon. She positioned herself between Turner and her children, ready to fight with every drop of strength she had. Turner hesitated for a moment, surprised by Margaret's ferocity, but soon he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "You can't win," he said, his voice dripping. But Margaret, with her heart throbbing with courage, did not go back. "I prefer to die to see my chained children," she replied, every word loaded with sincerity that even made Turner hesitant for a brief moment. The tension in the air was palpable, while Margaret and Turner stared at each other, each determined not to give in. However, Margaret knew that time was against her. The sound of the fight above intensified, and she knew it would not take long so that more officers would come down to reinforce Turner. It was then that, in an act of despair and love, Margaret made the most difficult decision of his life. With tears in her eyes, she turned to her children, whispering words of eternal love before bringing the knife close. But before he could act, a commotion broke up, diverting Turner's attention and giving Margaret the moment he needed. Robert, in a last act of bravery and sacrifice, had managed to cause a distraction, allowing Margaret and the others in the trapdoor to have a chance to escape. With a heavy but determined heart, Margaret took the opportunity. She grabbed her children and, with a renewed force, pushed them into a small secret exit that led it out of the house. The cold snow under his feet was a shock, but also a promise of freedom. With children in his arms, Margaret ran to the forest, the heart beating "Si-omo a drum on your chest." Behind her, the house was beginning to fill with shouts and chaos, a testimony of the sacrifice of Robert and the others who had been to fight. While running, Margaret felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He knew that the way ahead would be hard, but it was also certain that while he had breath on his lungs, he would fight for his children. The snow fell gently around him, covering his footsteps and offering a new hope that perhaps, only perhaps, they could find the freedom they so desired. Margaret Garner, with a heavy but indomitable heart, continued his escape, determined to honor the sacrifice of those who had been left behind and to ensure that their children never knew the horror of slavery. And so his story of courage and resistance continued, a flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. The cutting cold in the morning pierced the skin like ice needles, while Margaret Garner took refuge in a hidden clearing in the forest, away from the scene of chaos and destruction that had been left behind. Her hands, still shaking, firmly held their children, who, exhausted and confused, nestled against her in search of warmth and security. The silence around was only broken by the soft sound of the wind, which shook the trees with an almost whispered lament. But inside Margaret's heart, the storm had not ceased. The desperate escape from the refuge hung over her like a constant shadow, a painful memory of Robert's sacrifice and the others who had been behind us. Every step he took, every breath he took, was permeated by a crushing grief, a burden she knew she would have to carry forever. The children, small and vulnerable, were saved for now, but Margaret knew that time was against them. Slave hunters would not give up easily, and at any moment they could find them. The fear of being captured and seeing her children condemned to the same life of oppression she had known was a terror that eroded her inside. She needed to make a decision, and fast. While the sun was beginning to emerge on the horizon, dyeing the sky with a swine-red tone, Margaret felt the weight of reality fall upon his shoulders as a fatal sentence. She had heard stories of mothers who, in desperation, took extreme measures to protect their children from slavery. And now, these stories haunted her mind, a dark echo of a decision she never thought she would have to consider. Margaret looked at her young daughter, a child whose smile was as bright as the rising sun. She was innocent, oblivious to the horror of the world around her. But Margaret knew that if they were captured, this innocence would be destroyed, overwhelmed under the weight of the currents and brutality that slavery imposed. The desperation within Margaret grew, a furious tide that threatened to swallow it completely. With tears in her eyes, she pulled the girl closer, wrapping her in a tight hug. The warmth of his daughter's body was a comfort, a painful memory of what was at stake. Margaret knew she had to be strong, that she needed to do what was needed to make sure her children never tried the hell she knew so well. The wind whispered around it, as if nature itself were aware of the terrible decision that was formed in his heart. Margaret felt her body tremble, not cold, but a deep and overwhelming fear. She closed her eyes, seeking strength in Robert's memories, in the promises they had made each other to protect her children at any cost. And then, with a broken heart and torn soul, Margaret made the decision that no mother should have to make. It was an act of desperate love, a choice that could only be understood by those who knew the true horror of slavery. With one last soft kiss on her daughter's forehead, Margaret whispered words of eternal love. The blade she held in her hands was cold and relentless, a cruel reflection of the world around her. Margaret knew that there was no return, that this would be the last sacrifice he could make for his daughter. With a quick and accurate gesture, she assured that the girl would never know the currents, never feel the weight of oppression crushing her soul. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy stillness that spread through the clearing like a cloak of sadness. Margaret, with tears running down his face, held her daughter in her arms, her small body now at peace. It was a moment of indescribable pain, but also of relief, for Margaret knew that at least he had spared his daughter of a destination worse than death. As the sun climbed into the sky, Margaret got up, her heavy steps with the weight of her decision. She knew the journey was far from over, that she still needed to fight to ensure other children's freedom. But at that moment, while he looked at him to the horizon, Margaret promised herself that she would never forget the sacrifice made that day. And so, with a broken but determined heart, Margaret Garner continued his escape, a mother who had made the supreme sacrifice for love. His story of courage and resistance would be remembered not only as a testimony of the horror of slavery, but as a powerful symbol of the indomitable love of a mother who preferred death to oppression. The sound of horse hooves echoed through the forest, a foreshadowing of the inevitable destination that approached Margaret Garner and his children. The capture was quick and merciless, an orchestra of chaos and despair. Slave hunters, led by Caleb Turner, surrounded the clearing like hungry wolves, their shadows extending threateningly under the rising sun. Margaret, with a heavy heart for the recent loss, knew the escape had come to an end. The capture was brutal. Margaret's hands were tied with rough strings that cut her skin, a cruel souvenir of the currents she had tried to escape. His children, crying and confused, were pulled from their arms, and the impotence took over Margaret as a suffocating cloak. The screams of her young daughter still echoed in her mind, an incessant reminder of the sacrifice she had made to protect them. Driven back to Kentucky, the trip was long and painful, a march of shame that seemed to have no end. With each step, Margaret felt the weight of Turner's cold look on her, a constant reminder that he had won. But even in his defeat, Margaret refused to give in to despair. The flame of resistance that burned within it could not be erased, not as long as there was hope that its story could bring to light the horror of slavery. Margaret Garner's trial has become an event of national proportions, attracting the attention of abolitionists and defenders of slavery to the same measure. The court, an austere building of stone that seemed to exhale authority and oppression, was the scene of a confrontation that exposed the deepest wounds of a divided nation. The air inside the hall was impregnated with a palpable tension, an omen of the emotional hurricane to come. Sitting on the defendant bank, Margaret was a symbol of silent resistance. Its presence, despite being curved by pain and loss, exuded a dignity that could not be overshadowed. Margaret's eyes, dark like the night, stared at his accusers with an unshakable determination. She was not just there to defend herself, but to give voice to all those who had suffered in the clutches of slavery. The prosecutor, a bumpy man with a flushed face and thunderous voice, began the process with a vivid and cruel description of the crimes Margaret was accused. He painted a painting of horror, highlighting his daughter's death as a barbaric act, a desperate attempt to escape justice. But to Margaret there was no regret in his heart, just the certainty that he had done what was needed to protect his children. Margaret's defense was assumed by an abolitionist lawyer, a middle-aged man named Jonathan Ellis, whose passion for the cause was evident in every word he uttered. Ellis introduced Margaret to the jury not as a criminal, but as a desperate mother, a forced woman to make an impossible decision in a world that did not offer her mercy. He spoke about the brutality of slavery, about the invisible currents that imprison the spirit as much as the body. Witnesses were called to the bank, each bringing a fragment of cruel reality that Margaret and many others faced daily. There were reports of relentless whip, from separate families, from lives destroyed by a system that treated humans as goods. Their words were dagged, piercing the hypocrisy of a society that considered itself civilized, but allowed such atrocity to happen under its compliant gaze. Outside the court, multitudes gathered, divided between those who supported Margaret and those who cried for their conviction. The air was loaded with conflicting emotions, hatred and compassion, justice and revenge. Margaret became a symbol, a catalyst for a fervent debate about the morality of slavery and the struggle for freedom. The trial continued, each day bringing new revelations, new layers of a story that refused to be buried. Margaret, in his chair, was a pillar of silent force, his presence a constant memory that the struggle for freedom was not a choice, but a necessity. She knew that regardless of the verdict, her story had already had an impact. She had already planted seeds of doubt and questioning in the hearts of many. Finally, after weeks of testimonials and arguments, the day of the verdict arrived. The audit room was crowded, the heavy air with the anticip action. The jury, a group of men who represented the diversity of opinions of the time, entered silently, their unscrutable faces. Margaret looked up, his eyes finding Jonathan Ellis's, who offered him an encouraging smile. The judge, an elderly man with severe face, announced the verdict with a voice that was no emotion. While the words echoed through the room, Margaret remained motionless, the determination in his unshakable heart. The verdict was guilt, a decision that many had already anticipated. But for Margaret, the result was not the end. She had done her part, had exposed the brutality of slavery to the world, and that itself was a victory. While being led out of court, Margaret kept his head up. The shouts of the crowd were deafening, a cacophony of support and condemnation. However, among the voices, Margaret heard something that made her smile. A child raised on her father's shoulders, waving at her with a look of admiration and hope. It was a reminder that his story, his fight, had played lives, had lit a flame of resistance that could not be erased. Margaret Garner was taken back to prison, his destination still uncertain. But she knew that regardless of what was happening, her story would live, echoing through the ages as a testimony of the indomitable power of the human spirit. And while the cell doors closed behind her, Margaret whispered a promise to the wind, a promise that one day freedom would prevail. America was in convulsion. The story of Margaret Garner, the fugitive slave who preferred death to her daughter to slavery, echoed throughout the country, breaking the barriers of silence and forcing a nation to look at her own atrocities. The headlines of the newspapers shouted the tragedy, and on every corner, alleys, and meeting halls, Margaret's name was pronounced as a scream of despair, a supplication for compassion and change. In New York's bright gas halls, where the rich gathered to discuss politics and businesses, Margaret's story was a hot topic. The elite, who had so long closed his eyes to the realities of slavery, could no longer ignore the issue. It was impossible not to imagine in her place, facing the decision impossible to sacrifice a child to spare him from a life of oppression. Margaret had become an uncomfortable mirror that reflected the moral failures of an entire society. In Philadelphia, the boiling headquarters of abolitionism, Margaret's history burned the hearts of those who fought for freedom. Meetings were held in muffled basements, where men and women crowded to hear inflamed speeches that cried for justice. Margaret's face pamphlets, his deep and challenging eyes, were distributed on the streets, inciting the population to join the scourge of slavery. Further south, the climate was of anger and resistance. Slave states saw Margaret's history a threat to their way of life. Pro-slavery newspapers painted her like a heartless criminal, a woman who had broken the sacred bonds of motherhood. They used their case to reinforce the need for more severe leaks laws and to justify the brutality with which slaves treated. But in fact, Margaret's story had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of many who had previously accepted slavery as a necessary evil. Ordinary people who lived far from political debates began to question the morality of a system that led a mother to make such a desperate decision. Margaret's name had become synonymous with resistance, an inspiration to those who fought in the shadows for freedom. In the capital, Washington, D.C., Congress could no longer ignore increasing pressure. Fervous debates took over the cameras, with politicians dividing between those who wanted to maintain the status quo and those who, driven by Margaret's tragedy, saw the urgent need for change. Margaret Garner's case had become a catalyst for broader discussions about human rights and the very definition of freedom. Abolitionists took every opportunity to bring their history to light, organizing lectures and events that attract crowds. Photos of Margaret, his features marked by fighting and pain, were shown in meetings, accompanied by passionate speeches that cried for empathy and action. It was impossible to hear about his devastating choice without feeling a knot in his throat, without wondering what kind of world allowed such a choice to be necessary. In literature and the arts, Margaret had become an emblematic figure. Writers and poets began to create works inspired by their history, using their words to give voice to those who had been silenced for so long. Plays were staged for audiences that came out of the theaters with tears in their eyes, to the representation of such a palpable, such real pain. And so, from north to south, from east to west, the story of Margaret Garner spread, a resistance moth flying over the winds of change. Each person who heard his name, who knew his sacrifice, was forced to confront his own morality, to question the world in which he lived, and to consider the role he could play in creating a fairer future. Margaret's tragedy not only shocked America, but also inspired a movement that required the humanity of the enslaved to be recognized, that their voices were heard, and that their chains be broken forever. And while his story echoed through the corridors of power and the hearts of the people, Margaret Garner's legacy continued to grow, a powerful memory that, even in the face of despair, the human spirit could shine harder than any tyranny, stronger than any oppression. The snow fell gently over Kentucky's desolate landscape, covering the ground like a white blanket, almost erasing the scars of a time when chains and whips dictated the fate of men and women. Decades had passed since that fateful night that Margaret Garner, a woman of indomitable courage, had challenged her own death to protect her children from slavery. The wind howled between the naked trees, carrying echoes of a past marked by pain and resistance, whispering stories that refused to be forgotten. Margaret Garner, with his sacrifice and determination, had become a perennial symbol of struggle and hope. His history, passed from generation to generation, had become a legend that inspired those who sought justice and equality. In Black communities, his name was pronounced with reverence, a constant memory that freedom, though harshly conquered, was an inalienable right. Margaret was not just a desperate mother. She had been a warrior, an almost mythical figure whose legacy echoed through the ages. The years advanced, but the wound left by slavery would take a long time to heal. Each brick of each house built on this soil seemed to carry the weight of generations that suffered in silence. But Margaret's story was a spark that refused to erase, illuminating the darkest corners of collective memory with its tireless shine. She had become an inspiration to the abolitionists who continued to fight, even after the formal abolition of slavery against the persistent injustices. And then, in a different time and space, a deep-eyed writer, and sharply found in Margaret's history, a muse for his own creation. Toni Morrison, with his lyrical and powerful prose, captured the essence of Margaret's sacrifice in his masterpiece, Beloved. Through words impregnated with pain and beauty, Morrison brought to life the silenced voices of the past, transforming Margaret's personal tragedy into a universal narrative on love, loss, and redemption. Beloved, laureate with the Pulitzer Award, was not only a tribute to Margaret's courage, but also a deep meditation on the horrors of slavery and its lasting repercussions. Morrison, with his unparalleled ability, intertwined historical facts with fiction, creating a rich and complex rug that challenged the notion of time and space. The work resonated deeply with all who read it, offering a glimpse not only of pain, but also of the resilience that defined the African American experience. Through Beloved, Margaret Garner became more than a historical figure. It has become a symbol of resistance to all future generations. In his pages, Morrison captured the essence of Margaret's struggle, portraying her as a woman who, in the face of absolute despair, chose to protect her children from a worse destination than death. It was a choice that overflowed with love and sacrifice, a choice that, although tragic, was understandable in a world where freedom was a fleeting dream. In classrooms and literary circles, Beloved has become a powerful educational tool, inciting discussions about race, identity, and the continuous struggle for equality. Margaret's story, immortalized in Morrison's prose, continued to challenge and inspire, reminding the world that physical currents can be broken, but emotional scars require time and understanding to be healed. Thus, Margaret Garner, a woman who dared to challenge the norms of her day, continued to live in the hearts of those who fought for a fairer world. Its history, shaped by pain and perseverance, served as a reminder that freedom is not just a right, but a duty to be defended with every fiber of being. On each page of Beloved, in each heated discussion about the legacy of slavery, the spirit of Margaret hovered, and timeless witness of the indomitable force of the human will. Margaret Garner's legacy, perpetuated by Toni Morrison, transcended the limitations of time, echoing through generations as a call to action and reflection. And while autumn leaves slowly fell on Kentucky's ground, Margaret's story remained narrated, a melody of resistance and hope that would never be silenced.